There's a lot to be angry at in our world. There is so much injustice, so much greed, so much hatred, and so much grasping after power. Even in places where we might normally look for hope, we often see more of the same. It can be depressing, to say the least. So what in the world should we do about it? Hello, I'm Eric Stensland, and welcome to another episode of Beneath the Surface, where we take a quick break in our day to reflect on some of the deeper things of life. If you enjoy this episode or have questions, please leave a comment below and consider subscribing so you don't miss future episodes. Last week I was in Cleveland, and over dinner with a friend, he told me about an incident that profoundly impacted his life. When he was a teenager, he invited a friend of his to come to church. Yet at church, he was pulled aside by numerous people, including the pastor, reprimanding him for bringing this friend. You see, my friend is white, and this friend he brought with him to church was black. He was so stunned by their bigoted response that he never went back. He was angry, and with very good reason. He wanted nothing more to do with this church, or with church at all. Yet years later, he realized that it wasn't the faith that was wrong, but rather the church's refusal to live by that faith. So he decided to show what the church was supposed to be. He became a minister, starting an interracial church and teaching other churches how to foster a beautiful diversity in their congregations. Instead of wallowing in anger and bitterness, he chose to live out what he saw was lacking. That reminds me a lot of St. Francis of Assisi, who lived in Italy during the early 13th century. He came from a wealthy family and a life of privilege. After having an encounter with God following time as a prisoner of war, he sensed God calling him to rebuild his church. He thought that meant he was to physically rebuild the chapel near him, but upon completion of that project, he realized he was actually being called to something much bigger. The Catholic Church was in a very unhealthy state, and so he gave his life not to fighting the church and pointing the finger, but to living out a radical alternative, being what it was supposed to be. Where the church leadership was caught up in wealth and power, he rejected both and chose to live a life of simplicity and poverty, spending his time with the poor and those in need. He started a movement of service defined by humility. Where the church declared war on Islam, he knew that the call of Christ was to love your enemies. So he went to Egypt, where the Crusades were happening, and walked right across the battle line to build friendship and dialogue with the Sultan of Egypt. Where the church seemed to totally ignore the natural world, he recognized our commonality with it, recognizing our relationship to all things. He fostered a care for the natural world that had been lacking. His simple acts of radical demonstration have reverberated across the world, and his movement can still be found operating today, 800 years later. Too often we find ourselves pointing the finger at the wrongs in our world. Those wrongs are everywhere, and yet if this becomes our focus, we become angry and bitter people. In the process, we don't fix anything, but only spread discontent. St. Francis, as well as my friend, show us a better way to live. We can choose to become the goodness that our world needs, not just talking about it, but by demonstrating a more beautiful way. Let me finish today by reading a prayer that is often attributed to St. Francis, though its origins are probably much more recent. It was probably attributed to him because it reflects the way he lived and this idea of becoming the good that our world needs. It also speaks to the quiet and paradoxical way that change and healing comes into our world. Now, I'm sure you've heard it before, but listen closely, and perhaps you might identify a way that you can become the goodness that our world needs now. It says, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, let me bring joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life." Now, this way of living is anything but easy, and yet this is what our world needs. It's what our souls need. Our attention is always drawn to what's wrong, But instead of ignoring it or getting angry at the wrongdoers, we can live in the opposite spirit and bring healing to our little corner of the world. This week, will you pay attention to your thoughts? When you start to notice yourself becoming angry and critical, perhaps you should stop and begin to consider what you can do to become the light in this dark space.